I think I knew I needed feminism before I knew what feminism was. My name is Ream, and I'm from Chicago, Illinois, in the US. I'm a writer, and I'm an activist. I really have dedicated my life to the idea of story. My grandmother, who was this extraordinary matriarch, and my mom were in most ways the dominant forces in the home. My dad sat at the head of the table. Every model was highly patriarchal. You were told that your place in the world and your role in the world was in relation to men. What could you help men do? How could you appeal to men? How did you look to men? And so literature for me was the beginning of really seeing other women, and not only outside of my own community, but outside of my own time, outside of my own nation in some cases, and starting to see this pretty extraordinary through line in female experience. The first time anyone called me feminist might have been before I even understood what feminist was, because it was probably some moment when I stood up for myself. I did something that challenged the male order. I was probably contrarian enough at that age and difficult enough that if you called me the thing that was not popular in my hometown, I kind of wanted more of it. I have a vague memory of my grandmother referring to rock and roll as debauched. I remember thinking, I don't know what that word means, but I like it. Oh, whatever it is, I want more of that. So in my late teens, at actually a used record store that in the corner had all these books that they were also selling, I think for 10 cents each or something like that, there was a Ms. Reader. It was basically the first edition of Ms. Magazine that had been turned into a book. And I found that it's the first time that I ever had been introduced to contemporary feminism. And that was definitely a light bulb moment where all of these themes that were kind of whirling in my head started to make a kind of sense. And that the sense it made was that I needed to be a part of that movement. One of my earliest memories in the anti-rape movement, I lived in Washington, D.C. at that time. And debatably, the very first rape crisis center in the U.S. was either in Berkeley, California, or Washington, D.C. And so I was a young woman, a survivor of sexual violence, and I started volunteering at the D.C. Rape Crisis Center. And all of these second wave feminists, real powerhouses in the anti-violence movement, were my role models there. And I was in a meeting one day, and I referred to myself, and this room full of women who I revered turned to me almost at once and said, "Anne, you are not a victim. You are a survivor." They kept going, and I leaned forward and I said, "Wait, I need to say something. I am a victim and was a victim of violence. And I'm not ashamed of that. And it's not a bad word. And it doesn't make me weak. Something was done to me, and I don't want to disappear it. And it doesn't mean I can't still survive. It doesn't mean I'm not forceful. It doesn't mean I'm not powerful. We have politicized and vilified the word victim and instead shifted to survivor in a way that is really politically problematic. Because if there are no victims, there is no injustice. And so how we use terms like victim or survivor, how we use terms like rape, how we define forms of violence, it does matter. And it is not to say that in every interaction when you're subjugated to the male gaze, or the discomfort of being harassed, or existing in an office where you're treated like a second-class citizen, or having to negotiate the complexity of being strong and smart and sexual and wanting to own all those things. You know, it's a complicated world for women, all women. The Voices and Faces Project, we're at the end of this year going to be rebranded as Center for Story and Witness. And it really started through my own experience of writing a book, which was a memoir of a 10-year journey documenting the stories of survivors of gender-based violence globally. And in many cases, I followed these stories and got to know these survivors over years. And so there was a deep bond between me and this group of over 100 people that I interviewed and that we photographed. And as I got to know them, not only were they just really open, extraordinarily open to being in this book and sharing their stories, but often they talk about their own desire to write or speak about their story. And my very closest friend, who is a wonderful novelist, Dar Clifton Spargo, who now teaches creative writing at Yale, and he really was the one who had the idea and said, what would it be like to create an immersive 2-day testimonial writing workshop where survivors read and think about how people have used story to create social change across history and throughout social movements. Look at great literature, whether it's Reverend King or Primo Levi or Adrienne Rich or Cynthia Ozick, Simone de Beauvoir. You know, let's look at people who have used story, and specifically their own story, to call the world to change, and create a workshop where survivors of gender-based violence can start to reflect on how to do that themselves. And all of feminism, in a sense, emerged from narrative. Women speaking their truths to one another, to the world, and saying, this is my lived reality, and there are social and political structures that have created that reality. Feminism is in many ways why I believe in the social services safety net. It's why I believe in a living wage. I do not think, why I believe in national health care. Why when I'm in a place like this, I feel a deep shame and sadness that in the US we did not have that. Because I don't think we can actualize as women without those systems. It doesn't matter how strong I am. The only people who will actualize without those systems are going to be the privileged. Feminism is a political and social movement. It's an ideology. And in its truest form, it calls us to, through the lens of our own experience with being marginalized, to identify with other marginalized communities, specifically women, to start to say, what are the social and political factors, not the personal factors? Because I think part of what we struggle with in the US is this idea that feminism is leaning in or owning your agency, and you can change the system just by changing yourself. That will only be true when millions of women change themselves enough to demand that the system change. We can't individually do it. And so I think the first thing we have to start to grapple with is to call yourself a feminist is to say, I am in solidarity with other women, persons who identify as women, people who are marginalized. And that solidarity calls me to action.